Welcome back to another Thought Leadership podcast in cannabis. This is Abe Cohn with THC Legal Group, and today we have a guest, Jake, with us. Jake, thank you for being with us. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you, Ed?
Great. This podcast really is about talking to new people with interesting ideas and a lot of experience in the cannabis space. Tell us more about yourself, how you got involved, and kind of what you're doing right now.
So I really fully got involved in this industry about 6 months ago.
Okay.
Historically, my career has always been in commercial real estate and institutional debt and equities. So as a real estate guy, I wanted access to the industry, and I wanted to figure out what the best need was and the best application for my skills. And it seemed that real estate seems to be one of the largest upfront capital-intensive investments and trouble spots that cannabis operators have. It starts with locating the piece of property, and then on top of that, there's obviously restrictive zoning around that property, and it's different state to state, city to city, 1,000 feet away from a park, a school, a daycare, etc. And then to even apply for your license, you have to have the property recognized and tied to that license to even get approval. Take that a step further. You can't go to a bank. You can't approach traditional landlords. And it really leaves this huge problem spot for cannabis operators to get their businesses up and running.
I see.
So I ended up taking my skills and partnering with another group that started as herbfront.com, and they launched a little bit over 2 years ago as a technology platform. And that technology is all based around the real estate and the restrictive zoning around such. So we build out predictive zoning maps, and we have 42 markets mapped out across the country. So we're well ahead of where most of the states and cities are in terms of getting their legislation through. So we target down to the parcel level what real estate would be compliant for a cannabis operator to open up their business. So it takes the guessing work out of it. We've been in touch with a lot of people who, before using our platform, were going on Google Maps, trying to draw lines and guess, okay, is this 1,000 feet? Is it not?
Yeah.
Are they measuring to the middle of the property or the edge of the property? Is that actually the edge of the property? So we have urban planners on staff with direct relationships with city planners in all the markets that we map out. So we can confirm with certainty what real estate is compliant and which ones operators should really be targeting. But then obviously on top of that, then what? You find the property. How do you get there? You can't sign a lease with the tenant, with the landlord. You can't go to a bank. So we have now raised money behind us, and we are acquiring the properties and leasing them back to qualified cannabis operators as tenants. So in that way, it frees up a significant amount of capital as a marijuana business owner that you don't have to go to third-party equity raises to acquire a piece of real estate. It allows you to keep your equity in your own business, keep it in working capital, keep it in operations and payroll and inventory and everything that you should be focusing on rather than having to deal with the real estate.
So it's
really just aligning core competencies.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to make sure I understand you correctly. It sounds like you guys are actually becoming the landlords yourselves. You're buying this property, and then you are doling it out to qualified business owners. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
So that is quite a bit of risk you guys are assuming. I mean, how do you buy the property first? Do you buy the property according to the demand, or are you picking out, good spots and, anticipating what might be a likely, let's call it a place of high opportunity for you to then go and sell it to the business owners? How does that work? How do you know which property to even acquire?
It's really neither one of those.
Okay.
We intend to make direct relationships with the end users. So we won't buy a piece of property unless we know who is going to be leasing it from us. And we go into the process, both parties eyes wide open. We have full transparency in terms of what the lease payment is going to be, and that's basically based on the cost that we end up incurring by purchasing the real estate. And we do our underwriting with the tenant beforehand, and we make sure that obviously the lease payments fit in with the pro forma that the tenant is going to need to be able to live up to be able to be profitable themselves. We try not to take advantage of the industry. More so, we want to continue helping the industry. We started the technology platform as a service offering. And we really look at our capital platform as expanding that service offering. Because typically, for these guys to get into any piece of real estate, a lot of times they're taking out hard money loans.
Yeah.
They're getting 18 to 24 month terms with heavy points in and heavy points out and 12 to 15% interest rate. It's almost crippling to an operating business.
This is
when we work together, we have confidence that our lease payment fits into the profitability projections that the tenant is going to need to have for them to be profitable, make more money for them. And then on our side, we have confidence that they're going to continue to be able to afford that lease. So on some ends, you say we're taking more risk, but on other hand, it's actually, as real estate investments go, pretty risk averse because we're not doing anything speculative. We already have our underwriting done, and we know who the tenant's going to be, and we feel confident that they're qualified to be able to make the lease payment. So I look at it as a win-win, and really something that's lacking in this industry.
One of the reasons landlords kind of traditionally are more cautious about supplying their space for cannabis businesses is because cannabis is still federally legal under Class 1 of the Controlled Substance Act, Schedule 1 rather of the Controlled Substance Act. So do you share any of those concerns, specifically that, God forbid the federal government would come in and seize the property and hold the landlord as responsible as the tenant? Does that bother you or not so much?
You can't say it doesn't bother you. Obviously, that's the big 800-pound gorilla in the room of this industry that's keeping everybody back. And that's the reason why traditional banks and institutions aren't adding liquidity into this industry.
Yep.
That exact fact is our opportunity to come in and do what we're doing. We structure our ownership of the property and structure the leases very carefully, where our ownership is purely a real estate ownership and has no direct ties to either an equity holding in the license holder, the operator, or has any direct revenue sharing. We only structure base rental payments. We never structure in any kind of percentage revenue or percentage rents that are based on the actual sale or cultivation of the plant. And in that way, we stand a full step away from the actual operation, which, to your point, is federally still illegal. Now, we structure the lease and the ownership of the property based on state law. So as long as that operation is operating legally in that state, which a lease is a state document, not a federal document, then both the landlord and the tenant are both protected. There's a clause in that lease that if for some reason something changes in that legislation and it becomes an illegal operation, that the landlord basically has the right to terminate that lease. Now, end of the day, if the DEA wants to come in and pick a fight, who's to say that they can or cannot do what they want to do? They're the DEA. Realistically speaking, because the ownership of the license holder and the ownership of the property are completely separate entities that have no direct ties to one another, even in that disaster situation, they come in and shut down the operator and try to seize all assets, it would be very difficult for them to try to get to the real estate. And we've gone through a lot of thought and legal counsel and specific deal structuring to ensure that our investors are protected from that risk.
Okay, well, that's very good to know. And certainly under the Obama administration and under the guidance of the Cole memo and some of the other internal documents that were kind of produced and then circulated throughout the Justice Department, it does seem that the federal government has a hands-off position as long as you're operating within the legal constraints of that state. But look, I mean, with Donald Trump and Sessions coming in and taking over, who knows what's going to happen, right?
Well, who knows? You could talk to 10 different people, get 10 different opinions, and you know what? All 10 of them might be wrong.
Yeah.
The way I look at it, and we've done a lot of research and put a lot of thought into this, and trust me, our investors have done a lot of thought and had a lot of conversations about it as well. And even though the Republican administration and the cabinet that Trump is surrounding himself with, obviously including Jeff Sessions as Attorney General, tends to be conservative and quote-unquote anti-pot,
Yep.
they've all been on record being pro-states. And
that is the fundamental conflict. You know, that is one of the rare areas where the libertarians and the Republicans both kind of converge and then diverge at the same time. So yeah, that's very interesting, definitely.
With the overwhelming acceptance of the states, especially this past November, let's take Florida, for example. Massive population, big swing state.
Yep.
Overwhelmingly voted marijuana into their legislation, 71% positive. Florida is a massive red state that voted Trump into office. With all the other big things on their campaign and their ticket that they're trying to tackle in terms of immigration and free trade and so many other bigger issues, one of those big issues is righting the economy for the Fed and for the states. I don't see a reasonable risk of derailing the progress that the states have already made in this industry, especially as we're proving how substantial the revenue base is going to be going back to the states from the excise tax. You look at what's coming out of Colorado as it is, you start replicating that from a population base in California and Florida, and it's hard to ignore. And I really don't see them putting this on their front burner of something that they tend to attack.
The money aspect of all of this, of course, is absolutely critical. And I want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, which many entrepreneurs in the space, unfortunately, have had to contend with, which is that banks, especially the large banks, are still kind of keeping a hands-off approach to cannabis. They're worried about the money. What could it be seized? They just don't want to open up accounts that touch the plant. How do you go about dealing with companies like that? You know, in your experience, how are these companies managing their money? How do you interact with them vis-a-vis the money as far as transferring between banks? You know, how does all that work in your experience?
My experience is the stronger, more sophisticated operators have found a way for banking capabilities. And that's actually one of our due diligence items is we need proof of banking capability by the tenant. Because to your point, we don't want to be accepting rent in duffel bags of cash.
Right.
So typically, I think just like we're structuring our property ownership that stands a full step away from the plant, we've found that a lot of the more sophisticated cannabis business owners tend to have more than one legal entity. And they have one legal entity that is actually the license holder and another entity that is either a consulting firm or an operating company or something like that, that they basically offer a suite of consulting services in terms of how to grow, training of staff, etc., that gets the right to the vast majority of the revenues from the actual license holder. And by doing that, I believe that's how most of them are getting banks to bank their businesses.
Very interesting.
And now those banks are not Wells Fargo. They're not JP Morgan. They tend to be state charters, savings and loans, smaller regional banks, typically chartered in the state that the cannabis is legal and that business is operating. And I think that they've become comfortable with that industry enough to do so. Now, the loan is a different side of the story rather than just taking deposits. Traditionally speaking, there is still no reasonable debt that is available to these kind of businesses, and that goes to the real estate as well. even in our platform, that is a full step away from the actual license holder, that isn't participating directly in the revenues from the plant itself, even we have difficulty finding solid debt partners. And like I said earlier, the majority of it that is available tend to be hard money loans. So, you look at the struggles in the industry, but that also is the opportunity. Because if you are smart enough and clever enough to basically structure your business sophisticated in a way that you can conduct your business, eventually down the road, things are going to change. And banks and institutions are going to start looking at this industry with true credit quality. And as soon as that happens, if you've been able to be one of the fortunate few that have formed a profitable business at that point, you're going to start to see a real windfall of success. And I think that's what everybody's waiting for. But on the other side, if it were easy, then everyone would do it, right? There's really only the select few that have really figured out a way to do it smart enough to be successful. And there's already been some rounds of industry consolidation in the more mature markets, and I think that's going to continue down the road. Now, one of the things that I don't see changing anytime soon is the state boundaries. So if you look at the tobacco and liquor industries, even though liquor is still mandated by state legislation, you can still transport the product from state to state. In that way, you can truly commoditize the product. And I mean, it can be produced in mass by Miller Coors and Anheuser-Busch, and it's a true price point product that people are buying. If you're in a liquor store and you're looking at Miller Lite or Bud Light, and one of them's $1 cheaper than the other to buy a six-pack, you're probably going to get the cheaper one. But that doesn't mean that you don't have microbrews that are wildly successful, that might be twice as expensive as buying a case of Miller Lite, but they're less distributed. You might only be able to get them in a specific state or a city or a region, and I think that's always going to exist in this industry. So even if way down the road you have commoditization of the plant and big tobacco is packaging them up in cases and there's no differentiation, I still think that state boundary is going to restrict the mass distribution of that kind of product, and you're always going to have state and regional players that have brand recognition and a real product that people want to get.
One of the things that listeners of this podcast, and certainly kind of people at the beginning of the evolution of their entrepreneurial experience in this space, what people want to know is, how to overcome some of these initial barriers to success. And, we want to kind of learn from other people's failures and obstacles that somehow can be learned from if possible. So in your experience, what do you think people in this industry should know about before they really get into it? What should they be expecting? What type of issues should they expect to arise? And how do you feel they can best overcome those issues?
I think that could potentially be a laundry list of issues.
Okay.
This industry, probably more than any other, has experienced so many bumps along the road. And I think, to make it short, that's what you should expect. Okay. You shouldn't expect for it to run smoothly. You should expect for legislation to change rapidly, and you're going to have to be able to change along with it. Now, to sum that up into one single point, I'd say it's to be very well capitalized. If you're operating on a shoestring budget and you come into a bump in the road, you have big issues. You need to be able to absorb those problems. So if you are raising money, if you are putting together a pro forma and a budget, overestimate how expensive it's going to be. Overestimate how long it's going to take to get to profitability and make sure that you can handle if it ends up taking longer than expected. Make sure you can handle if something changes in legislation that increases your costs to produce. Make sure you can absorb that. Because I think the problem is people have a very tight budget. You put every penny you have together to get a business up and running, and 9 months down the road, if you thought you were going to be profitable at that point and you're not, you have big problems. So I think that's the main thing, is expect things to go wrong, expect things to take longer than you want them to take, and make sure that you're capitalized to be able to absorb all of that.
I think that's spectacular advice. In general, people kind of, certainly in this industry, people talk about the green rush, but all entrepreneurs, it's so easy to just watch the highlight reel of success in other companies and say, that's going to be me, without seeing all of the hard work and the challenges that kind of go into the successful enterprise of any business. So I think that really is wonderful advice.
I think one thing to focus on is, you talk about that highlight reel of success of these big names in the industry that everybody recognizes that have many licenses, both in cultivation and dispensaries. They didn't get there overnight, for one. And a lot of those licenses that they now hold were either acquired or absorbed by people who failed. And I think that's very important to recognize. Because there have been many license holders who tried to jump in the green rush because everybody's making money. It's got to be easy, right? It's not. And a lot of those guys are not in business anymore. So I think it's very important to realize that point, that the big players probably came into it with a very sophisticated outlook, a lot of money behind them, and it took them a long time to get to where they're at now. And it probably came with acquiring other businesses. So I think that's important to focus on.
One of the criticisms of the startup community as it relates to tech is that it's just the graveyard for businesses run by people who would otherwise succeed in more conventional fields. So, of course, small businesses are feeling all the time in every sector. But with high tech and, tech startups, people would imagine, because of the education required to even get these things going, that you'd see a higher success rate. But that really is not the case. Do you feel that the cannabis industry also has perhaps a higher attrition rate than, let's call them more vanilla neutral kind of regular startups and businesses, just because of how difficult it is reconciling these federal restrictions with statewide permissibilities?
I have to think so. I think putting a hard number behind that or data behind that is probably pretty tough to do. But there's probably been a lot of people who failed before they even really got started also.
Okay.
Just because of the high barriers of entry and difficulty in just getting one of these businesses off the ground. And I think that's something, you look at the technology sector, there's really no barriers of entry there. You have a good idea, you get some developers behind it, and you try to come up with something, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but you don't really need that much capital necessarily, or even additional thought to get it going. You just have a good idea, and you give it a try.
Right, absolutely.
And in this situation, you can't do that. You can't wing it in this industry. You need to put a lot of thought behind it, you need to put a lot of money behind it, and it takes a long time. So that's why I was saying I think there's probably a lot of guys that fail before they even start, because just the application process of trying to get one of the licenses, I think, stops a lot of people from even getting in.
I really love that as almost the central message, which is, as you just said, you can't wing it in this industry. You don't just figure it out as you go along. And even though the law is evolving kind of in real time in a very meaningful way, that doesn't mean you as the business owner should also be just kind of figuring it out on the fly. You need professional people in the space to guide you, help you, and marshal all of their experience to ensure your own success. We're wrapping up here. I really want to make sure that we give you an opportunity to leave all of the listeners with a final imparting thought. And of course, please let everyone know how they can reach out to you, get in touch, learn more about what you guys are doing, and of course, contact you.
Absolutely. Really, the main thing that I'd like to leave here is know that we're an option. Know that as you're putting your budgets together and your performance together and you're making your plan, the earlier you get us involved on the real estate side, the more options you're going to have. Because, again, the real estate tends to be a chicken and the egg situation for a lot of operators, because to get your license approved, you need the real estate figured out already. So not only do we have the technology to be able to target that real estate, but we can help you actually get into it also and be a cannabis-friendly landlord that allows you to focus on your core competency of running your business and not having to deal with property ownership. So I'd love the opportunity to discuss more with anybody that might be listening here. You can reach me at Jacob, that's Jacob, at herbfront.com. We also have websites at herbfront.com and herbfrontcapital.com that you can find a lot of information both about our mapping technology and about the capital platform that we offer as real estate owners and landlords. So thank you so much for having me on. It's been really a pleasure.
Beautiful. Okay, well, there you have it. Thank you so much, Jacob. This has been a wonderful experience. I think many people are going to learn quite a bit and hopefully really develop that resilience, the mental fortitude to know that the journey will not be easy, nor is it one that will guarantee success, but it's an exciting industry and we're all happy to be a part of it. So thank you so much, Jacob.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone, another amazing podcast with Cannabis Thought Leaders. This is Abe Cohn. Until next time.